The moment Dalton Reed pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the small church in Aztec, New Mexico territory, on that humid August morning in 1882, he knew his life was about to change, though he could not have explained why. He had come down from the San Juan Mountains after 3 months of trapping beaver and hunting elk, his buckskin clothes still carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine, his dark hair hanging past his shoulders in waves that no amount of water could tame. The townspeople who bothered to glance his way saw exactly what they expected to see. A mountain man, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle, someone who belonged more to the wilderness than to civilization. But Dalton had made a promise to his late mother that he would attend church whenever he came to town, and he kept his promises. The service had already begun when he slipped into the back row, his boots making soft sounds against the wooden floor despite his efforts at silence. Reverend Thompson was reading from the Book of Ruth, his voice carrying through the small building with practiced ease. Dalton let his eyes wander over the congregation, noting the familiar faces and the few new ones. That was when he saw her. She sat alone in the third pew from the front, her auburn hair pinned up neatly beneath a simple bonnet, her dress, a modest blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. Everything about her posture spoke of solitude, not the comfortable kind that comes from choosing one's own company, but the painful kind that comes from having no other choice. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, and even from his position at the back, Dalton could see the tension in her shoulders. He watched as several families filed into the pews around her, carefully choosing seats that left distance between themselves and this woman. An older couple who had been heading for the spot directly behind her suddenly changed course and sat on the opposite side of the aisle. 2 young women in fine Sunday dresses whispered to each other as they passed, and though Dalton could not hear their words, the cruel curve of their smiles told him everything he needed to know. The service continued, and Dalton found his attention divided between the Reverend's words and the solitary figure in blue calico. She never turned around, never acknowledged the empty space that surrounded her like an invisible barrier. When the congregation rose to sing, her voice joined in, clear and sweet, and Dalton felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with the hymn. After the benediction, people began to file out, talking among themselves, making plans for Sunday dinner, discussing the weather and the crops and the latest news from Santa Fe. The woman in blue remained seated for a long moment, as if waiting for the crowd to thin before she had to run the gauntlet of their judgment. Dalton stayed in his pew as well, pretending to examine his worn Bible while keeping her in his peripheral vision. When she finally stood and turned toward the aisle, Dalton got his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he had expected, probably no more than 22 or 23, with delicate features that might have been called pretty if they had not been so carefully arranged into an expression of determined neutrality. Her eyes, a striking green even in the dim light of the church, remained fixed straight ahead as she walked toward the door. Dalton waited until she had passed his pew before standing and following at a respectful distance. Outside, the August sun beat down on the dusty street, and the congregation had split into small groups scattered around the churchyard. The woman in blue walked alone toward the edge of town, her pace steady but not hurried. Something about her solitude bothered Dalton in a way he could not quite name. He had spent most of his adult life alone in the mountains, and he understood the value of solitude. But this was different. This was isolation imposed by others, and it struck him as fundamentally wrong. The next Sunday, Dalton made sure to arrive at the church 15 minutes before the service began. He had spent the week in town rather than returning to his mountain cabin, telling himself it was because he needed to stock up on supplies and have his rifle repaired. The truth, which he acknowledged only in the quiet moments before sleep, was that he wanted to see her again. She arrived 10 minutes before the service, entering through the same doors with the same careful, neutral expression. Dalton watched from where he stood near the back as she made her way to the same pew, third from the front on the right side. She sat down, smoothed her skirts, and folded her hands in her lap in exactly the same way she had done the week before. As the church began to fill, Dalton observed the same pattern. People chose seats around her but never beside her. A family with 3 children started toward her pew, then the mother touched her husband's arm and steered them elsewhere. An elderly man with a cane actually stopped at the end of her pew, seemed about to sit down, then caught the eye of someone across the aisle and changed his mind. Dalton felt anger begin to simmer in his gut. He did not know this woman's story, did not know what she might have done to earn such treatment from her neighbors. But he knew judgment when he saw it, and he knew the particular brand of cruelty that came from people who believed themselves righteous. He started down the aisle before he could talk himself out of it. His boots echoed on the wooden floor, and he was aware of heads turning to watch him. The mountain man who rarely came to town, who lived alone in the high country, who spoke to more animals than people in any given week. He wondered briefly what they would make of what he was about to do. When he reached the 3rd pew, he did not hesitate. He stepped into the row and sat down directly beside the woman in blue, close enough that the rough fabric of his buckskin jacket brushed against her sleeve. She went absolutely still. He could see her hands tighten in her lap, her knuckles going white. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke. Then very slowly she turned her head to look at him. Up close, her eyes were even more striking than he had realized. They were the color of deep forest shade, flecked with gold, and they held a mixture of surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope quickly suppressed. "Madam," Dalton said quietly, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Thought you might like some company." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but had forgotten how. The silence stretched between them, and Dalton became aware of the whispers starting up around them. He could feel eyes on his back, could practically hear the thoughts racing through the minds of Aztec's upstanding citizens. "You do not have to do this," she said finally, her voice so soft he had to lean slightly closer to hear it. "I am used to sitting alone." "Nobody should have to get used to that," Dalton replied. "Not in a church, anyway. Seems to me that is the one place people ought to remember we are all equal before God." A flicker of emotion crossed her face, too quick for him to identify. "You do not know who I am," she said, "what I have done." "Do not much care," Dalton said honestly. "I know what I see right now, and what I see is a woman being treated poorly by people who should know better." Before she could respond, Reverend Thompson called the service to order. Dalton settled back against the pew, aware of the woman beside him and the weight of attention from everyone around them. He kept his eyes forward and his expression calm, as if sitting beside the town pariah was the most natural thing in the world. Throughout the service, Dalton could sense her gradual relaxation. The rigid tension in her shoulders eased slightly. When the congregation stood to sing, her voice rang out clear and true, not trying to hide or diminish itself. Dalton added his own rough baritone, and together they sang the old hymns while the whispers continued around them. After the final prayer, people began to file out as usual. This time, the woman did not wait for the crowd to thin. She stood up immediately, and Dalton stood with her. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time, "for sitting with me. You did not have to do that. Like I said, nobody should have to sit alone." Dalton paused, then added, "I am Dalton Reed. I have a cabin up in the San Juan Mountains, but I come down to town every month or so for supplies and such." "Adelaide Morris," she said after a moment's hesitation, as if she were not sure whether giving her name was a good idea. "I live on the edge of town in the old Parker place." "I know it," Dalton said. The Parker place was a small house that had stood empty for years after the family who built it moved on to California. It was not much, just a few rooms, but it was solid and well built. They made their way toward the door together, and Dalton could not help but notice how the crowd parted around them. Some people simply looked away, pretending not to see. Others stared openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval to outright hostility. An older woman in a black dress and severe bonnet actually made a point of turning her back as they passed. Outside, the August sun was even hotter than it had been the previous week. The dry New Mexico heat made the air shimmer over the dusty street. Adelaide paused at the bottom of the church steps, squinting slightly against the bright light. "Which way are you headed?" Dalton asked. She gestured to the east toward the edge of town. "Just down the road about a quarter mile. Mind if I walk with you?" The question came out before Dalton had fully thought it through, but once it was spoken, he realized he meant it. He wanted to know more about this woman who sat alone in church, who sang hymns with such a clear voice, who had somehow earned the scorn of an entire town. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing the decision. "That would only give people more to talk about," she said finally. "I expect they are already talking," Dalton said. "Might as well give them something worth discussing." A small smile touched the corners of her mouth, the first real expression he had seen from her. It transformed her face, making her not just pretty but genuinely beautiful. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Reed." "Dalton," he said. "And I have been called both, depending on who you ask." They started walking together, leaving the churchyard and its whispering congregation behind. The road was lined with cottonwood trees that provided some relief from the sun, and the sound of the Animas River could be heard in the distance. For a while, they walked in comfortable silence. "You are wondering what I did," Adelaide said eventually, her voice matter of fact. "To make them all hate me so much." "Only if you want to tell me," Dalton replied. "Like I said, it does not change what I saw this morning." She was quiet for several more steps, and Dalton thought she might not answer at all. Then she said, "I came to Aztec 2 years ago with a man I thought I was going to marry. His name was Richard Dalton. He had come through my hometown in Kansas, charmed everyone including me, and promised me a new life out west." Dalton listened without interrupting, sensing that this was a story she had not told many times. "We traveled together, just the two of us, for 3 weeks," Adelaide continued. "He said we would get married as soon as we reached New Mexico territory, that it would be more romantic to start our new life together in a new place. I believed him." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "I believed every word." They passed a group of men standing outside the general store, and Dalton saw them nudge each other and stare. He resisted the urge to glare back, keeping his attention on Adelaide. "When we got to Aztec, Richard suddenly had all sorts of reasons why we needed to wait to get married. First, it was because he needed to establish his business. Then it was because he wanted to build us a proper house. Always another reason, another delay." She took a shaky breath. "I was living in a boarding house and people were starting to talk. I did not understand why Richard kept putting off the wedding. Then one day the marshal got a telegram from Kansas. Richard Dalton was not his real name, and he was wanted for fraud and theft in 3 different states." Dalton felt his jaw tighten. "He ran, like a coward," Adelaide confirmed. "Left in the middle of the night, took what little money I had along with everything of value from several other people in town. They found his horse 2 days later near Farmington, but he had disappeared, probably made it to Colorado or Utah. And the town blamed you, Dalton said, understanding now. I was the woman who traveled alone with a man for 3 weeks without being married, Adelaide said simply. In their eyes, that makes me no better than a prostitute, whether I knew what Richard was or not. The fact that he made a fool of me and stole from me does not matter. What matters is that I compromised myself, that I broke the rules, that I am a reminder of how even respectable people can be deceived. They had reached the edge of town now, where the buildings gave way to scattered houses and open land. The Parker place stood by itself about 100 yards off the main road, a small wood frame house with a neat garden out front. I am sorry that happened to you, Dalton said, and he meant it. The anger he had felt in the church was now focused and sharp. You did not deserve that, either from him or from them. Adelaide stopped walking and turned to face him fully. The sun caught the red highlights in her auburn hair, and her green eyes were bright with unshed tears that she was clearly determined not to let fall. You are the first person in this town to say that to me, she said. The first person in 2 years who has shown me any kindness at all. Then this town is full of fools, Dalton said bluntly. Begging your pardon, but I have known actual criminals, men who have done real harm, and they get treated better than you are being treated. A tear escaped despite her efforts, tracking down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, almost angrily. I have thought about leaving, she admitted. Going somewhere else, starting over where nobody knows my story, but I barely make enough from my sewing to keep myself fed and housed. I have no money for travel, no family to go to, and why should I leave? I did nothing wrong. You should not have to leave, Dalton agreed. You should be able to live your life without being treated like you have the plague. They had reached her gate, a simple wooden affair that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Adelaide rested her hand on it but did not open it. Thank you for walking with me, Dalton, she said, and for sitting with me in church. It meant more than you probably realize. I would like to do it again, Dalton said. Next Sunday, if you are willing. Her eyes widened slightly. You would come back, even knowing what people will say. I do not care much what people say, Dalton replied. Never have. One of the benefits of living alone in the mountains is that you get used to making your own decisions without worrying about gossip. Adelaide smiled again, that same transformation of her features. Then I would like that very much. They stood there for a moment longer, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Finally, Dalton touched his hat brim again. Until next Sunday, then. Until next Sunday, Adelaide echoed. Dalton waited until she had gone inside and closed the door before he turned and started back toward town. His mind was already working through the logistics. He had enough money saved from his trapping to stay in town for another week or two, maybe longer if he was careful. He could pick up some work, probably at the lumber mill or helping with construction. The town was growing, and there was always need for men with strong backs and willing hands. As he walked back past the general store, one of the men who had been standing outside earlier called out to him. You are making a mistake, Reed. That Morris woman is nothing but trouble. Dalton stopped and turned slowly, fixing the man with a level stare. He was a stocky fellow with thinning hair and a prosperous look about him, probably one of the town's merchants. The only mistake I see is how you all are treating her, Dalton said quietly. She did not steal from anyone. She did not lie to anyone. She was the victim of a con man, same as some of you. She traveled alone with that man for weeks. Another man chimed in, younger and more aggressive. Everyone knows what that means. It means she trusted someone who did not deserve it, Dalton replied. Last I checked, that was not a crime. but spreading poison about someone, making their life miserable for something that was not their fault, that seems pretty close to a sin to me." He did not wait for a response, just turned and continued down the street. Behind him, he could hear the men muttering among themselves, but he paid them no mind. He had said what needed saying, and he would not take it back. The week that followed was strange for Dalton. He was used to solitude, to days passing with only the sound of wind in the pines and the calls of birds for company. Being in town, surrounded by people and their noise and their constant activity, was always an adjustment. But this time, he found himself thinking constantly about Adelaide Morris. He took a job at the lumber mill, spending long days cutting and hauling timber. The work was hard but familiar, and the physical exertion helped clear his mind. The other workers were friendly enough, though a few of them made comments about him sitting with Adelaide in church. Dalton ignored them, focusing on his work and earning his pay. In the evenings, he found himself walking past the Parker place, though he was careful not to be obvious about it. Sometimes he would see Adelaide in her garden, tending to the vegetables she grew or hanging laundry on the line. Once, she looked up and saw him, and she raised her hand in a small wave. He waved back, feeling ridiculously pleased by the simple gesture. Sunday came around again, and Dalton made sure to be at the church a full 20 minutes before the service. He stood outside, waiting, ignoring the looks and whispers from the arriving congregation. When Adelaide appeared, walking up the road in the same blue calico dress, his heart did an unexpected flip in his chest. "Good morning," he said as she approached. "Good morning," she replied, and there was a warmth in her smile that had not been there the week before. "I was not sure you would really come back." "I said I would," Dalton reminded her. "I keep my word." They walked into the church together, and this time the whispers were even louder. Dalton could feel the weight of disapproval pressing down on them like a physical thing, but Adelaide seemed less affected by it than she had been the previous week. She held her head high as they made their way to the third pew, and when they sat down together, she did not leave any space between them. The service passed in much the same way as before, with Reverend Thompson preaching about compassion and forgiveness, while his congregation glared at the two people who had dared to defy their collective judgment. Dalton found himself barely listening to the sermon, too aware of Adelaide beside him, the clean scent of soap and lavender that clung to her, the sweet sound of her voice when they sang the hymns. Afterward, they walked back to her house together again, and this time, Dalton noticed that Adelaide seemed more relaxed, more willing to talk. She told him about her sewing work, how she did mending and alterations for some of the families in town, though they always made her pick up and deliver the work through the back door. She talked about the vegetables she grew and how she was hoping to preserve enough for the winter. She mentioned, almost shyly, that she liked to read, and that the Reverend, who was kinder than most, sometimes lent her books in turn. Dalton told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands after his mother died 5 years ago. He described the wildlife he encountered, the severe beauty of winter in the high country, the peace that came from being surrounded by nothing but nature. He talked about trapping and hunting, about the delicate balance of taking only what he needed and respecting the land that sustained him. At her gate, they paused again, neither wanting to end the conversation. "Would you like to come in for some water?" Adelaide asked. "It is a hot day, and you have a long walk back to town." Dalton knew he should say no. Having him seen going into her house would only add fuel to the gossip fire. But when he looked at her, at the hope and uncertainty in her green eyes, he could not bring himself to refuse. "Water would be good," he said. "Thank you." The inside of the Parker place was simple but clean, with mismatched furniture that Adelaide had clearly worked hard to make comfortable. Fabric scraps and sewing supplies occupied one corner, and a few books were stacked neatly on a shelf beside the fireplace. Everything spoke of a woman making the best of difficult circumstances, creating a home out of very little. Adelaide poured water from a pitcher into 2 tin cups and handed one to Dalton. They sat at the small table near the window, and for a while they simply enjoyed the relative coolness of the shade and the refreshment of the water. "Can I ask you something?" Adelaide said eventually. "Of course." "Why did you really sit beside me that first Sunday? The truth, I mean." Dalton considered his answer carefully. "I saw you sitting alone, saw how everyone was treating you, and it made me angry," he said honestly. "I have always had trouble standing by when I see something that is not right. My mother used to say I had an overdeveloped sense of justice." He smiled at the memory. "She meant it as a criticism, but I always took it as a compliment." "And now," Adelaide asked softly, "you keep coming back. Is it still just about justice?" Dalton met her eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear of being hurt again. He knew his answer mattered, that this was one of those moments that could change everything. "No," he said simply. "Now it is because I want to know you, because I like talking to you. Because when I am around you, I feel something I have not felt in a long time." "What is that?" she whispered. "Like maybe being alone is not the only way to live," he said. The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Adelaide set down her cup with a hand that trembled slightly. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Afraid to trust again. Afraid to believe that someone could actually care about me after everything that has happened." "I understand that," Dalton said. "And I would never push you or rush you, but I want you to know that I am not Richard Dalton. I am not going to lie to you or use you or disappear in the night. When I say something, I mean it." Tears spilled down Adelaide's cheeks, but this time she did not try to hide them. "I want to believe that," she said. "I want it so much." Dalton reached across the table and took her hand gently in his much larger one. Her fingers were small and work-worn, with calluses from her sewing needles. "Then believe it," he said. "Give me a chance to prove it to you." She nodded, unable to speak, and squeezed his hand tightly. They sat there for a long time, holding hands across the table, while the afternoon sun slanted through the window and painted everything in shades of gold. Over the following weeks, Dalton and Adelaide fell into a pattern. He would come to church on Sunday, sit beside her despite the continuing disapproval of the congregation, and afterward walk her home. Sometimes he would stay for water and conversation, sometimes just for a few minutes at the gate. During the week, he would find excuses to pass by her house, and she would come out to talk with him. Dalton found work wherever he could in Aztec, determined to stay close to Adelaide. He helped repair the bridge over the Animas River when flooding damaged it. He worked for a rancher who needed help moving cattle. He did odd jobs for anyone who would hire him, saving what money he could while spending the rest on necessities, and occasionally on small gifts for Adelaide. A book he found at the general store that he thought she would like. Fresh coffee beans, a luxury she could rarely afford. Once, a length of pretty fabric that he had seen her admiring. Adelaide, in turn, began to open up to him in ways she had not opened up to anyone in years. She told him about her childhood in Kansas, about her parents who had died of fever when she was 17, leaving her alone and vulnerable. She talked about her dreams, small and practical though they were. A house of her own that did not leak when it rained, enough money to buy fabric to make herself a new dress, the simple pleasure of being able to walk through town without people whispering. One evening in September, as the heat of summer was finally beginning to break, Dalton brought Adelaide a basket of wild strawberries he had found growing near the river. She laughed with delight when she saw them, the sound so pure and genuine that it made his heart ache. "I have not had strawberries in years," she said, popping one in her mouth and closing her eyes in pleasure. "Oh, they are wonderful." They were sitting on the small porch of her house, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. The air was cooling rapidly, the way it did in the high desert, and Adelaide had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Dalton wanted to put his arm around her, to pull her close and share his warmth, but he held back. They had held hands many times now, and once she had leaned her head on his shoulder, but he was careful not to push for more. He could feel her trust growing slowly but surely, and he would not risk damaging it. "I have been thinking," Adelaide said after a moment, her voice tentative, "about what you said about your cabin in the mountains, what it is like up there." "It is beautiful," Dalton said, "especially in the fall. The aspen trees turn gold, and when the sun hits them just right, it looks like the whole mountainside is on fire." "It sounds peaceful," she said wistfully. "Sometimes I think about what it would be like to live somewhere far from people, far from their judgment and their cruelty." "It can be lonely," Dalton admitted. "Before I met you, I did not realize just how lonely it had become. I thought I liked the solitude, and I do in some ways. But now I know the difference between being alone by choice and being alone because there is no one you want to be with." Adelaide turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the last rays of the sunset. "And now there is someone you want to be with." "Yes," Dalton said simply. "You, Adelaide." "I want to be with you." She drew in a shaky breath. "I want that too," she said. "But I am afraid of what people will say, afraid of what it might mean for you. You have a life, a reputation, and I do not want to ruin that." "My reputation is that I am a mountain man who keeps to himself and does not care much for society," Dalton said with a slight smile. "Spending time with you has not changed that. If anything, it has made people remember that I exist, which might actually be worse for my reputation." That earned him a small laugh, which had been his intention. But then Adelaide's expression grew serious again. "I care about you, Dalton," she said softly. "More than I thought I could care about anyone again. You have shown me kindness when I had forgotten what kindness felt like. You have made me feel like maybe I am not as ruined as everyone says I am." "You are not ruined," Dalton said fiercely, taking both of her hands in his. "You are brave and strong and good, and anyone who says otherwise is a fool." "But what if we are making a mistake?" Adelaide asked. "What if this ends badly like before? I do not think I could survive that again." "Then we will make sure it does not end badly," Dalton said. "Adelaide, I am not a man who speaks fancy words or makes grand gestures. But I can promise you this. I will never lie to you, I will never abandon you, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust. That is all I can offer, but I offer it freely and completely." Tears were sliding down her face again, but she was smiling through them. "That is more than anyone has ever offered me," she said. "More than I ever thought I would have." Dalton reached up and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. The gesture was tender, intimate in a way that went beyond mere touch. "Say you will give us a chance," he said. "Say you will let me court you properly, the way you should have been courted from the beginning." "Yes," Adelaide said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Dalton, I will give us a chance." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close while she cried against his chest. He could feel her trembling, could feel the years of pain and isolation pouring out of her. He simply held her, stroking her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort until the storm passed. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but she looked lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I must look terrible," she said, trying to laugh. You look beautiful, Dalton said honestly. You always look beautiful to me. She kissed him then, leaning forward and pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was tentative and sweet and full of hope. Dalton responded carefully, keeping the kiss gentle, letting her set the pace. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing a little harder, and the world seemed full of new possibilities. After that evening, their relationship deepened in ways both small and profound. Dalton continued to work in town, but now he spent every evening at Adelaide's house, helping her with chores, talking for hours about everything and nothing, slowly building a life together even before they had officially committed to one. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people simply ignored them, pretending that the relationship did not exist. Others were more openly hostile, particularly some of the older women who saw Adelaide as a threat to the moral fabric of the community. A few people, surprisingly, began to soften their stance. The Reverend made a point of greeting them both after church one Sunday, which Dalton suspected was his quiet way of expressing approval. A young couple who were relatively new to town invited them to dinner, explaining that they had always thought the treatment of Adelaide was unjust. But there were also darker moments. One night, someone threw a rock through Adelaide's window with a note attached that called her vile names. Dalton, who had been there when it happened, felt rage unlike anything he had experienced in years. He wanted to storm through town demanding to know who was responsible, wanted to make them pay for their cruelty. But Adelaide stopped him, placing a hand on his arm and looking up at him with those green eyes. "It will not help," she said quietly. "It will only make things worse. They want to get a reaction, want to prove that we are as bad as they think we are. Do not give them that satisfaction. They cannot treat you like this," Dalton growled, but he stayed where he was, letting her calm him down. "They can, and they have been for 2 years," Adelaide said. "One rock through a window does not change anything. What matters is that you are here, that I am not alone, that I have someone who cares whether I live or die. That is what matters, Dalton, not them." He pulled her close, feeling protective and helpless all at once. "I wish I could take you away from here," he said. "Take you up to the mountains where nobody could hurt you." "Maybe someday," Adelaide said. "But not yet. Not like we are running away. If we leave, it should be because we are moving towards something, not because we are being driven out." Her wisdom and strength amazed him. She had been through so much, had been beaten down by circumstances and cruelty, yet she had not let it make her bitter or weak. If anything, she had emerged stronger, more determined to live life on her own terms. As the weeks passed and September gave way to October, Dalton knew he needed to make a decision. His cabin in the mountains would need preparation before winter set in, and he could not put it off much longer. The thought of leaving Adelaide, even temporarily, was almost physically painful. But he also knew that he could not stay in town indefinitely, working odd jobs and living in a boarding house. He needed to plan for the future, their future, if Adelaide would have him. One evening, as they sat together on her porch watching the stars come out, Dalton broached the subject. "I need to go back up to my cabin soon," he said, "to get it ready for winter and check my trap lines. I will probably be gone for a week or 2. He felt Adelaide tense beside him. "Of course," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You have your own life, your own work. You cannot stay here forever." "I do not want to leave you," Dalton said, taking her hand. "But I have responsibilities up there, things I need to take care of, and I need to make some decisions about the future." "What kind of decisions?" Adelaide asked. Dalton took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment he had been building toward for weeks. "Decisions about where I want to live and with whom," he said. "Adelaide, I love you. I did not plan to fall in love, but I have, completely and irrevocably. And I want to spend my life with you if you will have me." Adelaide's breath caught. "Dalton," she whispered. "I am not asking you to marry me right this second," Dalton continued. "I know we have not been courting long, and I know you need time to be sure, but I want you to know my intentions. I want to marry you, Adelaide Morris. I want to build a life with you, whether that is here in Aztec or up in the mountains or somewhere else entirely. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to be the person you turn to when you are happy or sad or angry or scared. I want it all, every bit of it with you." Tears were streaming down Adelaide's face again, but she was smiling wider than he had ever seen. "I love you too," she said. "I did not think I could ever love anyone again, but you proved me wrong. You showed me that not all men are liars, that not all trust is misplaced. You gave me back my faith in people, in myself." "Then say you will marry me," Dalton said, his heart pounding. "Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Say you will be my wife." "Yes," Adelaide said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Dalton Reed, I will marry you. I will be your wife, and I will build a life with you, and I will love you for as long as I live." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, pouring all of his love and commitment into the kiss. She responded with equal passion, her hands tangling in his long hair, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both of them were trembling. "When do you want to get married?" Dalton asked, resting his forehead against hers. "Soon," Adelaide said. "I do not want to wait. I have waited long enough for happiness. If you are ready, if you are sure, then I want to marry you as soon as possible." "I am sure," Dalton said firmly. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." They decided to get married the following week, before Dalton went up to his cabin. There would be no big ceremony, no fancy dress, no gathering of friends and family. Just the two of them, the Reverend, and maybe a witness or two if they could find anyone willing. It would be simple and quiet, but it would be real, and that was all that mattered. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Adelaide made herself a new dress from the pretty fabric Dalton had bought her weeks ago, staying up late to finish the sewing by lamplight. Dalton visited the Reverend to arrange the ceremony and was pleasantly surprised when the older man agreed immediately and even offered to let them use the church. "I have watched you with Miss Morris these past months," Reverend Thompson said. "I have seen how you treat her with respect and kindness, how you have stood by her when others would not. That is the mark of a good man, Mr. Reed. She will be lucky to have you, and you will be lucky to have her." "I know it," Dalton said simply. The wedding was set for the following Saturday afternoon. Word spread through Aztec with the speed of wildfire, and opinions were divided. Some people expressed outrage that Adelaide Morris, the fallen woman, was being allowed to marry in the church. Others seemed relieved that she would finally be leaving town, assuming that Dalton would take her away to his mountain cabin. A very few, expressed genuine happiness for the couple. On the day of the wedding, Dalton stood at the front of the small church wearing his cleanest clothes and trying not to fidget. He had trimmed his hair and beard, though not by much, and scrubbed himself until his skin was nearly raw. He wanted to look presentable for Adelaide, wanted her to be proud to stand beside him. The church was nearly empty. The young couple who had befriended them sat in the front pew, along with the owner of the boarding house where Dalton had been staying, an older man who had always treated him fairly. Reverend Thompson stood at the altar, his Bible open and ready. Then the door at the back of the church opened, and Adelaide walked in, and Dalton forgot how to breathe. She wore the dress she had made, a soft green that matched her eyes and brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. She had left her hair partially down, with some of it pinned up and some of it falling in waves around her shoulders. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, probably picked from her own garden that morning. She was not wearing jewelry or fancy accessories, but she did not need them. She was absolutely radiant. She walked down the aisle toward him, her eyes never leaving his face, a small smile playing at her lips. When she reached him, Dalton took her hand and brought it to his lips for a gentle kiss. "You are beautiful," he whispered. "So are you," she replied, and he knew she meant it, saw it in her eyes. The ceremony was short and simple. Reverend Thompson spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about commitment and trust and love. He did not mention Adelaide's past or the circumstances that had brought them together. He simply treated them as any other couple being joined in matrimony, and Dalton was grateful for that small dignity. When it came time for the vows, Dalton spoke as clearly and firmly, meaning every word. "I, Dalton Reed, take you, Adelaide Morris, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as we both shall live. I promise to be faithful to you, to protect you, and to stand by your side no matter what challenges we face. You have my heart, my loyalty, and my devotion from this day forward." Adelaide's voice trembled slightly as she spoke her own vows, but she did not falter. "I, Adelaide Morris, take you, Dalton Reed, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as we both shall live. I promise to be faithful to you, to support you, and to stand by your side no matter what challenges we face. You have my heart, my loyalty, and my devotion from this day forward." They exchanged simple gold bands that Dalton had purchased from the jeweler in town, spending nearly all of his savings on them. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife and told Dalton he could kiss his bride, the kiss was sweet and tender and full of promise. The small gathering clapped as they walked back down the aisle together, and for once, Dalton did not care what anyone else in Aztec thought. He had Adelaide and she had him, and that was enough. They spent their wedding night at Adelaide's house, which was now their house. Dalton had already moved his few belongings over during the past week. It was not much, but it was home, and it was theirs. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Adelaide whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" Dalton asked, holding her close. "For seeing me when I was invisible," she said. "For sitting beside me when I was alone, for walking with me when no one else would. For loving me when I thought I was unlovable." "You were never unlovable," Dalton said, kissing her forehead. "You were just surrounded by people who could not see what was right in front of them, but I saw you, Adelaide. I saw you from that very first Sunday, and I have not been able to look away since." They made love slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies, taking their time to explore and discover. It was Adelaide's first time, truly her first time despite the town's assumptions about her past, and Dalton was careful and patient, making sure she felt safe and loved. Afterward, as she lay curled against his chest, Adelaide said softly, "I never thought I could be this happy. I never thought I deserved it." "You deserve all the happiness in the world," Dalton replied, "and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." The next morning, they began making plans for the future. Dalton needed to go up to his cabin to prepare it for winter, but now they would be going together. Adelaide was nervous about leaving the only home she had known for the past 2 years, even if that home had been a place of pain. But she was also excited at the prospect of starting fresh, of building a life somewhere new with her husband. They spent a week getting everything ready. Adelaide sold what furniture they could not take with them and packed up her sewing supplies and her few precious books. Dalton purchased a mule to carry their supplies and made arrangements with a rancher to buy some chickens and a milk cow that they could pick up on their way out of town. On the morning they were set to leave, several people came by to say goodbye. The young couple who had befriended them brought a basket of food for the journey. The boarding house owner gave Dalton back some of the money he had paid for his room, saying he had overcharged him and wanted to make it right. Even Reverend Thompson came by with a wedding gift, a beautiful quilt made by his late wife. "She would have wanted you to have it," he said. "She always believed in giving people second chances and seeing the good in others. I think she would have liked you both very much." Adelaide hugged the quilt to her chest, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for marrying us, for treating us with kindness, for not judging me." "We are all sinners in need of grace," the Reverend said gently. "I just wish more people in this town remembered that." As they rode out of Aztec on a bright October morning, Adelaide looked back only once at the town that had been both her prison and her home. Then she turned her face forward, toward the mountains and the future, and did not look back again. The journey to Dalton's cabin took 3 days. They traveled slowly, partly because of the rough terrain and partly because they were in no hurry. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp with brilliant blue skies. They camped beside streams at night, cooking their meals over an open fire and sleeping under the stars. Dalton taught Adelaide how to identify different animal tracks and which plants were safe to eat. Adelaide told him stories about her childhood, sharing memories she had not thought about in years. By the time they reached the cabin, Adelaide felt like she had shed a layer of old skin and emerged as someone new. The woman who had sat alone in church, weighed down by shame and isolation, seemed like a distant memory. In her place was someone lighter, freer, more fully herself than she had been in years. The cabin exceeded Adelaide's expectations. It was solidly built, with thick log walls and a sturdy roof. Inside, there was a large main room with a stone fireplace, a separate bedroom, and a small loft for storage. Dalton had built most of the furniture himself. A large bed with a rope frame and a thick mattress stuffed with pine needles and grass, a table and chairs, shelves for storage, even a rocking chair. "It is not fancy," Dalton said, watching Adelaide explore. "But it is warm and dry and the location is good. There is a spring just a few yards away for water, and the hunting is excellent." "It is perfect," Adelaide said sincerely. "It is the most perfect place I have ever seen." They spent the next few weeks settling in and preparing for winter. Dalton showed Adelaide how to preserve meat by smoking it, how to store vegetables in the root cellar he had dug beneath the cabin, how to stack firewood so it would stay dry. Adelaide established her own domain in the cabin, organizing the kitchen area, setting up her sewing supplies, making curtains for the windows from fabric scraps. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and at night they would sit by the fire, talking or reading or simply enjoying each other's presence. Adelaide had never felt so content, so at peace with herself and her life. The silence of the mountains, which she had feared might be oppressive, turned out to be healing. Without the constant weight of judgment and gossip, she began to remember who she had been before Richard Dalton, before Aztec, before everything went wrong. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Adelaide and Dalton sat together on the porch watching the flakes drift down through the pines. Adelaide was wrapped in the quilt Reverend Thompson had given them, and Dalton had his arm around her shoulders. "You ever miss town?" Adelaide asked. "Other people, conversation, the bustle of civilization." "Sometimes," Dalton admitted. Mostly in the dead of winter when I have been snowed in for weeks and start talking to myself just to hear a human voice. But then spring comes, and I remember why I love it up here. The peace, the freedom, the feeling that I am part of something bigger and older than human concerns. I understand that, Adelaide said. I thought I would miss having neighbors close by, but I do not. I do not miss the gossip or the judgment or the constant feeling that I am being watched. Up here, I can just be myself. You can always be yourself with me, Dalton said, pulling her closer. That is one of the things I love most about you. You do not pretend to be something you are not. Winter in the mountains was harsh but beautiful. The snow fell deep, sometimes trapping them in the cabin for days at a time. But Adelaide did not mind. She had her husband, her books, her sewing, and endless quiet hours to think and dream and plan. Dalton taught her how to snowshoe so they could get around when the drifts were too deep for regular walking. He showed her his trap lines and explained how he chose where to set them. He took her hunting and was impressed when she turned out to be a natural shot with a rifle. "Where did you learn to shoot?" he asked after she brought down a rabbit with a single clean shot. "My father," Adelaide said. "He believed girls should know how to defend themselves and provide for themselves, just like boys. He taught me to shoot when I was 10 years old." "Smart man," Dalton said approvingly. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly with a simple meal and small gifts they had made for each other. Adelaide had sewn Dalton a new shirt from soft buckskin, decorating it with careful stitching. Dalton had carved Adelaide a beautiful wooden box with a fitted lid, perfect for storing her sewing supplies. They gave each other these gifts with shy pride, pleased to have created something with their own hands. "I have one more gift for you," Dalton said after they had exchanged their presents. He disappeared into the bedroom and returned with something wrapped in cloth. When Adelaide unwrapped it, she gasped. It was a beautiful rifle, smaller and lighter than Dalton's own weapon, with Adelaide's initials carved into the stock. "I ordered it before we left Aztec," Dalton explained. "Had it sent up from Santa Fe. I wanted you to have your own rifle, something that fit you properly. Every woman living in the mountains needs a good gun." Adelaide held the rifle carefully, running her fingers over the smooth wood and metal. "It is too much," she said, but her eyes were shining. "Nothing is too much for you," Dalton said simply. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly, beginning with a missed monthly course and morning nausea. When she finally told Dalton, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy?" Adelaide asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to describe it," Dalton said. "Adelaide, you have given me so much already. A home, a family, a reason to be more than just a man living alone in the mountains. And now a child. I feel like the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Adelaide felt healthy and strong, even as her belly grew round. Dalton was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about her doing too much work or taking unnecessary risks. Adelaide found it both touching and occasionally frustrating. "I am pregnant, not sick," she reminded him one day when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." "I know," Dalton said, "but you are my wife, and that is my child, and I cannot help but want to take care of you both." As Adelaide's due date approached in early autumn, Dalton made plans to bring her down to Aztec so she could be near a doctor. But Adelaide resisted the idea. "I do not want to go back there," she said. "Those people made my life miserable. I do not want them anywhere near my child." "But what if something goes wrong?" Dalton argued. What if you need help that I cannot provide? In the end, they compromised. Dalton rode down to Farmington, a larger town about 30 miles west, and arranged for a midwife to come stay with them for the last month of Adelaide's pregnancy. Her name was Mrs. Sarah Patterson, a capable woman in her 50s who had delivered hundreds of babies and knew her business. Mrs. Patterson arrived in mid-September and immediately took charge. She examined Adelaide thoroughly, declared her fit and healthy, and began preparing for the birth. She also regaled them with stories of her many years as a midwife. Some funny, some harrowing, all of them interesting on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Adelaide and Dalton had ridden out of Aztec together. Adelaide went into labor. Mrs. Patterson sent Dalton out of the cabin with instructions to boil water and stay out of the way. Dalton paced outside, listening to Adelaide's occasional cries, feeling helpless and terrified. The labor lasted through the morning and into the afternoon. Every time Adelaide cried out, Dalton wanted to burst through the door and do something, anything, to help her. But Mrs. Patterson had been firm in her instructions, so he forced himself to stay outside and wait. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set, he heard a new sound, the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. Moments later, Mrs. Patterson appeared at the door, smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy, strong boy with a good set of lungs on him." Dalton rushed inside to find Adelaide propped up in bed, sweaty and exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face. His tiny fists waved in the air, and his eyes were squeezed tightly shut. He was the most beautiful thing Dalton had ever seen, except possibly for his mother. "Can I hold him?" Dalton asked softly. Adelaide smiled and carefully transferred the baby into his father's arms. Dalton held his son with extreme care, terrified of doing something wrong. The baby's weight was almost nothing, yet it felt like he was holding the entire world. "What should we name him?" Adelaide asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not decided on anything definite. Now, looking down at his son, Dalton knew exactly what the name should be. "Thomas," he said, "after my father, Thomas Reed." "Thomas Reed," Adelaide repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." The baby responded by opening his mouth and letting out another wail, which made both parents laugh. Mrs. Patterson stayed for another 2 weeks, teaching Adelaide how to nurse the baby and care for him, making sure both mother and child were healthy and thriving. When she finally left, it was with payment in the form of furs and preserved meat, as well as promises that they would call on her again if they had another child. Life with a baby was both harder and more wonderful than either Adelaide or Dalton had anticipated. Thomas proved to be a demanding infant, wanting to nurse constantly and crying if he was put down for even a moment. Adelaide was exhausted much of the time, and Dalton found himself doing more of the household chores while his wife focused on the baby. But the moments of pure joy far outweighed the difficulties. The first time Thomas smiled at his father, Dalton nearly cried. The first time the baby grabbed Dalton's finger and held on tight, Dalton felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. Every little milestone, every new development, was a source of wonder and celebration. As Thomas grew from an infant into a toddler, Adelaide and Dalton settled into a rhythm of life that felt natural and right. They spent summers at the cabin, with Dalton hunting and trapping while Adelaide tended the garden she had planted and looked after Thomas. In the winters, when the deep snows came, they would sometimes go down to Farmington for a few weeks, staying in a boarding house and enjoying the relative comforts of town. Adelaide found she could make good money doing sewing and alterations, and she enjoyed the social contact more than she had expected. They never went back to Aztec. A few years after they left, they heard that the town had fallen on hard times, with several businesses closing and people moving away. Adelaide felt no satisfaction in this news, no sense of vindication. She had moved beyond caring about the opinions of people who had treated her so poorly. Her life was full and rich without them. When Thomas was 3 years old, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with more nausea and fatigue. But Mrs. Patterson came to stay with them again, and in the spring of 1886, Adelaide gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. Rose was a quieter baby than Thomas had been, with Adelaide's auburn hair and green eyes. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help with her care. Dalton, who had loved being a father to a son, found that being a father to a daughter was equally wonderful and perhaps slightly more terrifying. The thought of someday having to protect his little girl from the cruelties of the world made him fierce and determined. As the children grew, Adelaide taught them to read and write, using the books that Reverend Thompson had given her and others they had acquired over the years. Dalton taught them about the wilderness, how to track animals, identify plants, survive in harsh conditions. Both children learned to shoot, to trap, to fish, to tan hides, to preserve food. They were being raised to be self-sufficient and capable, able to thrive in the mountains or in town as circumstances required. When Thomas was 7 and Rose was 4, the family took a trip to Santa Fe. It was the furthest they had traveled together, and the children were wide-eyed at the size and bustle of the territorial capital. They stayed for a week, enjoying the sights and sounds, but all of them were happy to return to the mountains afterward. "I am glad we went," Adelaide said as they made their way back up the familiar trails, "but I am even more glad to be going home." "Me too," Dalton agreed, "though I think the children enjoyed it." "They did," Adelaide said, "but they know where they belong just like we do." Over the years, Adelaide and Dalton occasionally encountered people from Aztec. Most of these meetings were brief and awkward, with neither side having much to say to the other. But one summer, when they were in Farmington for supplies, they ran into the young couple who had befriended them and attended their wedding. The couple, whose names were James and Elizabeth Warren, greeted them with genuine warmth. They had left Aztec themselves a few years earlier and were now running a successful mercantile in Farmington. They invited Adelaide and Dalton to dinner, where the 4 adults and various children spent a pleasant evening reminiscing and catching up. "We always admired how you two handled everything," Elizabeth said over coffee after the meal. "The way you stood up to the town's judgment and built a life together despite everything. It gave James and me courage to make our own choices, to leave when we were not happy there." "We were just trying to survive," Adelaide said. "We never thought we were setting an example." "Sometimes the best examples are the ones we do not intend," James said wisely. That conversation stayed with Adelaide for a long time. She had never thought about her life in those terms, as something that might inspire or influence others. She had simply been trying to find happiness and safety after having both threatened. But perhaps there was something meaningful in that, in refusing to let others define you, in building the life you wanted rather than the life others thought you should have. As the years passed, Adelaide and Dalton's love only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of frustration and anger, but they always talked through their problems, always made sure to go to bed with conflicts resolved rather than letting resentment fester. They made love as often as their busy lives allowed, finding comfort and passion in each other's arms even after years of marriage. When Thomas was 15 and Rose was 12, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise. This pregnancy was the hardest of the three, and both Adelaide and Dalton worried constantly. But Mrs. Patterson, now in her 70s but still sharp and capable, came to help once again, and in the fall of 1896, Adelaide gave birth to another son whom they named Daniel. Daniel's arrival seemed to complete their family in a way none of them had anticipated. Thomas and Rose doted on their baby brother, and even at their ages, they enjoyed helping care for him. Adelaide, now in her late 30s, found motherhood easier this time around, perhaps because she had the help of her older children. When Thomas turned 18, he began talking about seeing more of the world. He wanted to travel, maybe even go back east to one of the big cities. Adelaide understood the desire even as it pained her to think of her son leaving. She and Dalton gave him their blessing, along with enough money to get started and stern instructions to write regularly. Thomas did travel, spending 2 years exploring various places before eventually returning to New Mexico territory. He had seen Denver and San Francisco, had worked on ranches and in lumber mills, had experienced both the excitement and the loneliness of being on his own. When he came back, he was more mature, more certain of who he was and what he wanted. "The world is big and interesting," he told his parents, "but the mountains are home. I want to build my life here like you did." Rose, on the other hand, showed no desire to leave. She was happy in the mountains, content with the life she knew. She had her mother's talent for sewing and her father's skill with tracking and hunting. She was independent and capable, and Adelaide knew she would have no trouble making her own way in the world when the time came. As the new century approached, Adelaide and Dalton found themselves reflecting on the life they had built together. It had been nearly 20 years since that first Sunday when Dalton had sat beside Adelaide in the Aztec church. So much had changed since then, yet the fundamental things remained the same. They still loved each other deeply. They still found joy in simple pleasures, a beautiful sunset, a good meal, their children's laughter. They still felt blessed by the life they had created together. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching Thomas and Rose play with young Daniel in the yard, Adelaide turned to Dalton and said, "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if you had not sat beside me that day?" "All the time," Dalton admitted. "I thank God every day that I made that choice, that I listened to whatever instinct or impulse led me to you." "I was so alone then," Adelaide said softly, "so convinced that I would spend the rest of my life being punished for something that was not my fault. And then you sat beside me, and everything changed." "You changed my life too," Dalton said. "I did not even realize how lonely I was until I met you. I thought I was content with my solitary life, but I was just going through the motions. You gave me a reason to live instead of just survive." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching their children. Finally, Adelaide said, "I want to go back." Dalton looked at her in surprise. "Back where?" "To Aztec," Adelaide said. "I want to see it again, see what happened to all those people who were so sure they were better than me. I want to walk through that town with my head held high, with my husband beside me and my children with me, and show them that their judgment did not break me." Dalton considered this. "Are you sure? We have built a good life away from there. Why risk stirring up old pain?" "Because I need to prove to myself that I am truly past it," Adelaide said. "That I have forgiven them, even if they never asked for forgiveness. That I can face them without fear or shame." So the following summer, the Reed family made the journey to Aztec. It had been nearly 18 years since Adelaide and Dalton had left, and they were curious to see how the town had changed. Thomas, now 19, Rose, 16, and Daniel, 6, were all excited about the trip, though none of them had ever been to the place where their parents' story began. Aztec had changed, but not as much as they expected. The town was smaller than it had been, with several buildings standing empty and boarded up. But there were also signs of new growth, new families moving in to replace those who had left. The church still stood where it always had, white paint peeling slightly but still solid. Adelaide stood in front of the church for a long moment, remembering. She remembered sitting alone in the third pew, week after week, enduring the loneliness and judgment. She remembered the first time Dalton had sat beside her, how shocked and grateful she had felt. She remembered walking out of this church as Mrs. Dalton Reed, beginning a new life with the man she loved. "You want to go in?" Dalton asked softly. Adelaide shook her head. "No, I have seen what I needed to see. This place does not have any power over me anymore." They walked through the town, and Adelaide was recognized by a few people. Some looked away quickly, apparently still uncomfortable. But others approached them, and to Adelaide's surprise, several people apologized. An older woman who had been particularly cruel admitted that she had been wrong, that she was sorry for how Adelaide had been treated. A man who had once refused to sell Adelaide supplies at the general store said he had thought about his behavior many times over the years and regretted it. Adelaide accepted their apologies with grace, thanking them for their words but not pretending that those words erased the past. She had forgiven them, truly forgiven them, but forgiveness did not mean forgetting. The family stayed in Aztec for just one night, at a small hotel that had been built since their time there. The next morning, as they prepared to leave, they stopped by the church one more time. The door was open, and inside, they could see someone sitting alone in one of the pews. It was a young woman, probably no more than 20, and she sat with the same posture of solitary isolation that Adelaide remembered so well. The sight made Adelaide's heart ache with recognition. Without saying anything to Dalton, Adelaide walked into the church and sat down beside the young woman, just as Dalton had once sat beside her. The woman looked up, startled, and Adelaide smiled at her. "Nobody should have to sit alone," Adelaide said gently. "Not in a church, anyway." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "You do not know me," she said. "You do not know what I have done." "I know what it feels like to be judged," Adelaide replied. "And I know that everyone deserves kindness and compassion, no matter what they may have done. So I am sitting with you, and I want you to know that whatever you are going through, it will not last forever. Things can get better. Life can surprise you." They sat together for a while, not talking, just being present with each other. Finally, the young woman said, "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means." "I think I have some idea," Adelaide said with a smile. She stood up and placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Be strong, be brave, and do not let others define who you are or what you deserve." Outside, Dalton was waiting with the children. He looked at Adelaide with understanding in his eyes. "You sat with her," he said. "It was not a question." "I had to," Adelaide said. "I saw myself in her, and I remembered how it felt when you sat with me. I wanted to pass that kindness forward." As they rode out of Aztec for the second and final time, Adelaide felt a sense of closure that she had not expected. The town that had once represented so much pain and shame was now just a place, nothing more and nothing less. The power it had once held over her was gone completely, replaced by the knowledge that she had survived, thrived, and built a beautiful life despite everything. Back at their mountain cabin, life continued its familiar rhythms. Thomas began courting a young woman from Farmington, the daughter of a rancher, and Adelaide and Dalton liked her immediately. Rose discovered a talent for drawing and spent hours sketching the wildlife and landscapes around the cabin. Daniel grew from a curious 6-year-old into an adventurous boy who wanted to explore every inch of the mountains. As Adelaide approached her 40th birthday, she found herself thinking about how much her life had changed since that day in church when a mountain man had noticed she always sat alone. She had been so broken then, so convinced that her life was effectively over. She had believed the things people said about her, had internalized their judgment and made it her own. But Dalton had seen past all of that. He had seen her, truly seen her, when she was invisible to everyone else. He had offered her kindness when she had forgotten what kindness felt like. He had loved her when she thought she was unlovable. And now, nearly 2 decades later, she had a life beyond anything she could have imagined. She had a husband who still looked at her with love and desire after all these years. She had 3 healthy, happy children who were growing into good people. She had a home, security, purpose, and joy. One evening, as she and Dalton sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Adelaide said, "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" Dalton asked, though he sounded like he knew what she meant. "For saving me," Adelaide said simply. "For seeing me when I was invisible, for giving me back my life." Dalton pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You saved me too," he said. "Maybe even more than I saved you. You gave me a reason to come down from this mountain, a reason to be part of the world again. You gave me love and family and purpose. So if there is any saving to be acknowledged, it goes both ways." "Then we saved each other," Adelaide said, smiling. "That sounds about right," Dalton agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, holding each other and watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Inside the cabin, they could hear their children talking and laughing, the sound of life and family and home. Adelaide thought about the young woman she had sat with in the Aztec church, wondering what her story was, hoping that someone would show her kindness the way Dalton had shown Adelaide kindness. She hoped that young woman would find her way to happiness, to healing, to a life beyond whatever circumstances had led her to sit alone in judgment and isolation. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Adelaide felt profound gratitude for the path her life had taken. It had been difficult, painful at times, full of challenges and hardships. But it had also been beautiful, full of love and joy and meaning. She would not change a single thing, not if it meant losing any part of the life she and Dalton had built together. "I love you," she said, turning to look at her husband's strong profile in the fading light. "I love you too," Dalton replied, meeting her eyes with the same warmth and devotion he had shown from that very first Sunday. "Always have, always will." The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as years always do. Thomas married his rancher's daughter and built his own cabin not far from his parents', establishing his own trap lines and his own life while remaining close to family. Rose eventually fell in love with a young man who worked for the railroad, and after much consideration, she decided to move with him to Denver, though she visited her family in the mountains as often as she could. Daniel grew into a strong young man with his father's build and his mother's eyes, and he showed every sign of wanting to follow in his father's footsteps as a mountain man. Adelaide and Dalton grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies accumulating the aches and pains of a life well lived. But their love remained constant, a steady flame that warmed them through every season. They still held hands as they walked. They still kissed each morning and each night. They still found reasons to laugh together, to talk for hours, to simply enjoy each other's presence. When Adelaide was 55, She fell ill with a fever that worried everyone. Mrs. Patterson, now quite elderly herself, came to help nurse her through it. Dalton barely left her side, holding her hand, reading to her, praying for her recovery. For several days, the outcome was uncertain, and Dalton faced the terrifying possibility that he might lose the woman who had become the center of his entire world. But Adelaide was strong, stronger than anyone realized, and she fought her way back to health. The recovery was slow, and she was never quite as robust as she had been before, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered to Dalton. "You scared me," he told her one evening after she was well enough to sit up and take solid food. "I thought I might lose you." "You are not getting rid of me that easily," Adelaide said with a weak smile. "We still have too much living to do together." "Promise me," Dalton said, gripping her hand tightly. "Promise me you will fight to stay with me for as long as possible." "I promise," Adelaide said. "As long as you make the same promise." "I promise," Dalton agreed. They kept their promises to each other. As they entered their 60s and then their 70s, they adapted to the changes that age brought. They could not do the hard physical labor they once had, but their children and grandchildren helped with the more demanding chores. They spent more time in Farmington during the winters, where the weather was slightly less harsh and medical care was more accessible. But every spring, they returned to their mountain cabin, unable to stay away from the place where they had built their life together. Thomas and his wife gave them 4 grandchildren. Rose and her husband had 3. And Daniel, who married a woman from Durango when he was 25, eventually added 5 more. 12 grandchildren in all, each one loved and treasured. The cabin that had once housed just Dalton, then Dalton and Adelaide, then their small family, now rang with the laughter and chaos of multiple generations whenever everyone gathered together. Adelaide loved these times, loved being surrounded by the family that had grown from the simple act of a mountain man sitting beside a lonely woman in church. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their entire extended family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. There was food and music and stories, with the grandchildren begging to hear yet again the tale of how Grandma and Grandpa had met and fallen in love. Adelaide and Dalton told the story together, each filling in details the other forgot, their hands clasped together on the table between them. "The most important thing," Dalton said to his assembled family, "is to never let fear stop you from doing what is right. When I saw your grandmother sitting alone in that church, I could have walked past her like everyone else did. I could have told myself it was not my business, that I should not get involved. But something inside me said that was wrong, that nobody should have to sit alone like that. So I sat beside her, and it changed my entire life." "The most important thing," Adelaide added, "is to never let others define your worth. For a long time I believed what the people in Aztec said about me. I thought I was ruined, unworthy of love or happiness. But Dalton showed me that their judgment was wrong. He saw my value when I could not see it myself, and he taught me that we all deserve kindness and compassion, no matter what mistakes we may have made or what circumstances we may have endured." Their children and grandchildren listened with rapt attention, even though they had heard versions of this story many times before. There was something about hearing it directly from Adelaide and Dalton that made it new each time, that emphasized the lessons it contained. Later that evening, after the party had ended and most of the family had returned to their own homes or set up camp nearby, Adelaide and Dalton sat alone on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. 40 years, Adelaide said wonderingly. "I never imagined I would have 40 years of happiness. There was a time when I thought I would never have even one happy year. "I never imagined having a family," Dalton said. "I thought I would live and die alone on this mountain, and that was fine. I was okay with that. But then you came into my life, and suddenly I could not imagine being without you. These 40 years have been the best years of my life, Adelaide. Every single day with you has been a gift." Adelaide leaned her head on his shoulder, the gesture as familiar and comfortable as breathing after 4 decades together. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day you walked me home from church?" "Which part?" Dalton asked with a smile. "You said that nobody should have to sit alone, not in a church anyway," Adelaide said. "That it was the one place where people should remember that we are all equal before God. Do you remember?" "I remember," Dalton confirmed. "Did not know I was being wise. I was just saying what seemed obviously true." "It was wise," Adelaide said. "It was one of the wisest things anyone has ever said to me, because you were right. We are all equal before God. We all deserve kindness and compassion. We all deserve to be seen and valued." That truth sustained me through so much in the years that followed. Whenever I struggled, whenever things were hard, I would remember what you said, and it would give me strength. Dalton kissed the top of her head, his lips resting in her gray hair for a long moment. "We have had a good life, haven't we?" he said softly. "The best life," Adelaide agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. You know what the most amazing thing is? I would not change a single thing, not even the hard parts, not even the pain. Because all of it, every bit of it, led me to you and to this life we built together. So even the worst moments were worth it in the end." They sat together long into the night, two old people who had loved each other through decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy, laughter and tears. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had lived and the legacy they were leaving. They made plans for the future, even though they both knew that the future was growing shorter with each passing year. As they finally made their way inside to bed, moving slowly and carefully as old bodies must, Adelaide paused at the door and looked back at the mountains silhouetted against the starry sky. "Thank you," she whispered, though she was not entirely sure who she was thanking. God, perhaps. Fate. The mysterious forces that had brought a lonely woman and a solitary mountain man together in a small church in Aztec, New Mexico territory, all those years ago. Dalton wrapped his arms around her from behind, and together they looked out at the wilderness that had been their home for so long. "Thank you," he echoed, his voice rough with emotion, "for everything." They lived for several more years after that anniversary, years filled with the gentle pleasures of old age. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own. They celebrated birthdays and holidays. They spent quiet days reading together, talking together, simply being together. Dalton passed away first, in his sleep one winter night when he was 79 years old. Adelaide woke in the morning to find him gone, and though her heart broke into 1,000 pieces, she was also grateful. He had not suffered. He had simply slipped away peacefully, surrounded by everything he loved, his home, his mountains, and most importantly, his wife. Adelaide lived for 3 more years after Dalton's death. She moved to Farmington to be closer to Thomas and his family, though she visited the mountain cabin as often as she could, unable to completely let go of the place where she had been so happy. She spent her days with her family, telling stories about Dalton, keeping his memory alive for the youngest grandchildren who had not known him well. On a Sunday morning in early spring, Adelaide put on her best dress and asked Thomas to drive her to church. It was the same church in Farmington where she and Dalton had sometimes attended during their winter stays, the church where the congregation had always treated them with kindness and respect. The service was beautiful, with hymns Adelaide remembered from her youth. Afterward, as the congregation filed out, Adelaide stayed in her pew for a moment, her old hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed in prayer. When she finally opened her eyes and stood to leave, she saw a young woman sitting alone several pews ahead, her shoulders hunched in a posture Adelaide recognized all too well. Without hesitation, despite her old bones and aching joints, Adelaide made her way forward and sat down beside the young woman. "Nobody should have to sit alone," Adelaide said gently, echoing the words Dalton had spoken to her so many years ago. "Not in a church, anyway." The young woman looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Adelaide smiled and patted the young woman's hand. "Things will get better," she said with the certainty of someone who knew this to be absolutely true. "They always do if you are brave enough to let them." They sat together for a while longer, two women separated by decades, but connected by the universal experience of loneliness and the powerful impact of simple kindness. When Adelaide finally stood to leave, she felt a profound sense of peace, as if this moment was the final piece in a long and complex puzzle. That night, Adelaide went to sleep in her bed at Thomas's house and did not wake up. She passed away peacefully, with a smile on her face, surrounded by the love of her children and grandchildren. At her funeral, which was attended by dozens of people whose lives she had touched over the years, Thomas stood up to speak about his mother. He told the story of how she had met his father, how a mountain man had noticed she always sat alone at church, how he had sat beside her and then walked her home after service, how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted more than 40 years and created a legacy that would continue for generations. "My mother taught us many things," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "She taught us to be strong, to be kind, to never let others define our worth. She taught us that everyone deserves compassion, that no one should have to sit alone. She taught us, by the example of her life, that it is possible to overcome even the worst circumstances, to find happiness and love even when it seems impossible." Her story began with a stranger showing her kindness when she needed it most. And she spent the rest of her life passing that kindness forward, touching countless lives in ways both big and small. As Thomas spoke, many in the congregation nodded in recognition, remembering their own encounters with Adelaide's kindness and wisdom. She had been a woman who understood suffering and therefore had infinite compassion for those who suffered. She had been a woman who had been judged harshly and therefore refused to judge others. She had been a woman who had been saved by love and therefore believed in the transformative power of love for all people. Adelaide Morris Reed was laid to rest beside her beloved husband in a small cemetery near their mountain cabin, in the place they had called home for so many years. The headstone, paid for by their children and grandchildren, bore both their names and a simple inscription chosen by their family. They sat together. Those 3 words told their entire story. Two people who had been alone, who had been lonely, who had been separated from the world by circumstances and choice. Two people who had found each other against all odds. Two people who had decided to sit together, to walk together, to build a life together. Two people whose love had created something beautiful and lasting, something that would echo through generations. In the years that followed, the story of Adelaide and Dalton was told and retold within their family and beyond. It became a touchstone, a reminder of the power of simple kindness, of the importance of seeing people truly rather than through the lens of judgment and prejudice. Parents told it to their children. Grandparents told it to their grandchildren. It became part of the family's identity, a foundation upon which they built their own understanding of what it meant to love, to be compassionate, to treat others with dignity and respect. The old cabin in the mountains still stood years later, lovingly maintained by descendants who could not bear to let it fall into ruin. It became a gathering place for family reunions, a pilgrimage site for those who wanted to feel connected to the couple whose love story had started it all. Inside, carefully preserved, were some of Adelaide's sewing supplies, some of Dalton's trapping gear, books they had read together, the quilt Reverend Thompson had given them as a wedding gift. And in Farmington, in Aztec, in Durango, and in scattered communities throughout the Four Corners region, there were people who remembered Adelaide Morris Reed, who remembered her kindness, her strength, her refusal to be defined by others' limited perceptions. There were women who told their daughters about her, holding her up as an example of resilience and grace. There were men who told their sons about Dalton Reed, about a mountain man who had the courage to sit beside a woman everyone else had rejected. Their story, which had begun so simply on a Sunday morning in 1882, with a man noticing a woman who always sat alone at church, with him sitting beside her, and then walking her home after service, had become something larger than either of them could have imagined. It had become a testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, to create beauty out of pain. It had become a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness can have ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or know. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, Adelaide and Dalton were together still, sitting side by side as they always had, their love eternal and unbreakable, their story complete.